The bitter wind howled through the dense pine forest, sweeping snow across the frozen ground in swirling eddies. The moon hung pale and distant in the sky, its silvery glow barely piercing the thick storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The wilderness of Montana, beautiful yet merciless, was no place for the weak. Max, a 4-month-old bobcat cub, crouched low in the snow, his small body trembling not only from the cold, but from sheer terror. His reddish-brown fur, still marked with kitten-like spots, stood out against the white landscape, betraying his position as he tried to remain hidden beneath a tangle of fallen branches. His keen eyes darted back and forth, ears twitching at every sound. He had been alone for 3 days, now 3 days since his mother had left to hunt and never returned. Hunger gnawed at his belly, a sharp, unrelenting pain, but something far more dangerous had caught his scent. The wolves had been tracking him for over an hour, their dark figures weaving through the trees like living shadows. He had seen them before, watched them from the safety of his mother's side, but never had he faced them alone. The leader of the pack, a battle-scarred alpha female with a sleek gray coat, moved with lethal precision, her golden eyes locked onto him. To her right, a massive male with a distinctive white chest flanked her, ensuring the cub had no escape. 3 younger wolves fanned out, their breath rising in the frigid air, tongues lolling in anticipation. Max's instincts screamed for him to run, but he knew better. Running meant triggering the chase, and he was far too small, far too weak to outrun them. He needed a miracle. 20 miles away, Jim Harrison adjusted his rifle strap and pulled his heavy coat tighter around his broad shoulders. At 58, he had spent more time in these forests than anywhere else. The Montana wilderness was his home, and he knew its rhythms better than most. A seasoned wildlife biologist, Jim had dedicated his life to studying the delicate balance between predator and prey, ensuring that nature was allowed to take its course with minimal human interference. Tonight, however, something felt off. He had been monitoring increased wolf activity near the Flathead National Forest, noting their movements along the edges of ranching territory. As he packed up his observation gear and prepared to head back to his truck, a sound cut through the howling wind, a sharp, high-pitched cry, raw with terror. Jim froze. He had heard countless animal distress calls before, but this one struck something deep within him. It wasn't the cry of a rabbit caught in a fox's jaws, nor was it the panicked shriek of a deer cornered by predators. This was different. It was young, desperate. His instincts took over before logic could intervene. Grabbing his tranquilizer rifle, Jim moved swiftly through the knee-deep snow, his snowshoes allowing him to traverse the drifts with ease. The sound had come from the east, near a rocky outcrop where he had previously seen bobcat tracks. His breath formed clouds in the cold air as he pushed forward, muscles burning from exertion. Then he saw them. The wolf pack had the bobcat cub cornered against a jagged slab of granite, their formation tightening as they prepared for the kill. The cub's fur bristled as he swiped desperately at the nearest wolf, his tiny claws catching nothing but air. The alpha, Shadow, lowered her head, muscles coiling like a spring before the final lunge. Jim didn't hesitate. He reached into his pack and retrieved a small, specialized canister one he had developed himself after years of studying predator deterrence. A mix of high-frequency sound and a chemical scent that mimicked the musk of rival wolves. He pulled the pin and threw it between the cub and the pack. The reaction was immediate. A piercing sound erupted from the device, cutting through the night like a blade. The wolves recoiled, ears flattening against their skulls, as the scent flooded their sensitive noses. Shadow snarled, uncertain for the first time, glancing at her pack as they shifted uneasily. Jim stepped forward, rifle at his side but posture firm. He wasn't here to fight, he was here to make them second-guess their decision. "Easy now, girl," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "There's easier prey out there." Shadow held his gaze for a long moment, her primal intelligence calculating the risk. Then, with a low growl, she turned sharply and melted back into the trees, her pack following suit. Within seconds, they were gone, their tracks the only evidence they had ever been there. Jim let out a slow breath before turning to the tiny cub, still pressed against the rock, chest heaving. Up close, the signs of malnutrition were obvious: ribs jutting out, fur matted, eyes glassy with exhaustion. "Well, kid," Jim murmured, kneeling down carefully, "looks like you've had one hell of a night." Max hissed weakly, but there was no real strength behind it. He was too tired to fight. With practiced movements, Jim shrugged off his coat and wrapped the trembling cub securely in its warmth. The little body barely weighed anything at all. "This one's different," Jim muttered under his breath as he rose to his feet. "Sarah's gonna have a lot to say about this." With the storm rolling in, he tightened his grip on his small bundle and started the long trek back to his truck. Jim trudged through the snow, his breath coming in steady clouds as he adjusted his grip on the small, trembling bundle in his arms. The storm was closing in fast, the wind picking up speed, whipping ice crystals against his exposed skin like tiny needles. He had no time to waste. The truck was parked nearly a mile away, and every second counted. He glanced down at the cub, whose tiny body was curled tightly within the folds of his jacket, whiskers twitching with exhaustion. He was still conscious, though barely. His head bobbed slightly with each of Jim's steps, but he no longer had the energy to resist. That was both good and bad. Good, because it meant Jim wouldn't have to wrestle with a frightened wild animal. Bad, because it meant the cub was dangerously close to shutting down completely. Dehydration, malnutrition, exposure, any one of those could be fatal, and this little guy was suffering from all three. The final stretch to the truck was brutal. The snowfall had thickened, visibility shrinking to just a few yards. Jim's legs burned as he pushed forward, each step through the drifts an effort, but he didn't slow down. The cub's life depended on it. Finally, the dark shape of his Ford F-150 emerged through the haze. He yanked open the door, the blast of warm air from the heater a welcome relief against his frozen face. Carefully, he placed the cub on the passenger seat, keeping him wrapped tightly in the jacket. The little body barely stirred. Jim frowned. That wasn't good. With practiced efficiency, he reached for his radio and flicked it on. "Sarah, you there?" A moment of static, then a crackling response. "Yeah, Dad, I'm here." "What's going on?" "I've got a special delivery for you," Jim said, his voice steady but urgent. Bobcat cub, maybe 4 months old. Malnourished, dehydrated. Just pulled him out of a bad situation with a wolf pack. There was a pause. Then Sarah's voice came back, sharper now, all traces of casual conversation gone. "Dad, you know the protocol. Predator-prey interactions." "I know," Jim interrupted. "But this one wouldn't have lasted another night. Trust me." Another pause, then a sigh. "All right. Bring him in through the back entrance. I'll have the exam room prepped. See you in 20. Jim tossed the radio aside, shifting into gear and pulling onto the snow-packed road. The drive was tense. He kept glancing at the cub, watching for any signs of distress, but the little guy barely moved. His breathing was shallow but steady. That was something. As they neared the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, Jim's thoughts drifted. He had spent decades working in these woods, tracking predators, studying their patterns, ensuring the balance of the ecosystem remained intact. He wasn't in the habit of interfering. Nature had its own brutal efficiency. The strong survived. The weak didn't. That was the way of things. But something about this cub, something about the way he had stood his ground against impossible odds, had struck a nerve. Maybe it was foolish sentimentality, but Jim couldn't ignore the pull in his gut, telling him he had made the right call. The rehab center came into view, its modest barn-like structure nestled against the tree line. The lights were already on, casting a warm glow against the encroaching storm. Jim pulled around back, parking near the entrance where Sarah was waiting, arms crossed, face unreadable. She was dressed in her usual scrubs and fleece-lined jacket, dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. She had the same sharp eyes as her father, the same quiet intensity. As Jim stepped out of the truck, she wasted no time. "Let's see him." Jim carefully unwrapped the jacket, revealing the small, curled form within. Sarah's expression softened just slightly as she reached out, running practiced hands over the cub's frail body. "Jesus," she murmured. "He's nothing but skin and bones." "Yeah," Jim agreed grimly. "Think you can save him?" Sarah shot him a look. "If he makes it through the night, he's got a chance. Let's get him inside." Jim followed as Sarah led the way into the clinic, the warmth inside instantly seeping into his frozen limbs. The exam room was already set up, bright lights, a stainless steel table, medical equipment laid out in neat rows. Sarah worked quickly, placing the cub under a heat lamp, checking his vitals, drawing blood. Jim watched in silence, knowing better than to interrupt when his daughter was in her element. She moved with efficiency and care, her touch gentle despite the urgency of the situation. After a few minutes, she exhaled, rubbing a hand over her forehead. "He's badly dehydrated. I'm starting fluids now. No broken bones, which is a miracle, but he's severely underweight. We'll have to start him on a careful feeding schedule. Too much too fast could shut down his system." Jim nodded, leaning against the counter. "You thinking long-term care?" "If he stabilizes, yeah. At least 2 months before we even consider release. He needs time to build strength, relearn how to hunt." She glanced at her father. "You sure about this, Dad? You don't usually get involved like this." Jim hesitated, then sighed. "I know. But something about this one, I don't know, feels different." Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Let's see if he makes it through the night first." Jim didn't leave. He pulled up a chair, settling in for a long watch. The storm raged outside, wind rattling the windows, but inside, the tiny bobcat cub lay curled beneath the heat lamp, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Against all odds, he had survived this long. Maybe, just maybe, he had a fighting chance. The storm raged outside, a relentless force of wind and snow battering against the clinic's windows. But inside, the atmosphere was calm, controlled. Sarah worked with quiet precision, administering fluids, monitoring the cub's vitals, ensuring his body temperature remained stable. Jim remained seated in the corner, arms crossed, watching every movement. He wasn't a veterinarian, but he had spent enough time in the field to recognize the signs of life hanging by a thread. The cub twitched slightly under the heat lamp, whiskers flicking, paws shifting as if caught in some half-conscious dream. That was a good sign. Movement meant energy, energy meant fight, and fight meant survival. Sarah adjusted the fore-drip, her brow furrowed in concentration. "He's stable for now," she said finally, straightening. "But the next 24 hours will tell us everything." Jim simply nodded. He had no intention of leaving. Hours passed, the storm eventually dying down, leaving the world outside buried under a fresh layer of snow. Inside the clinic, time moved slowly. Jim dozed in his chair, waking periodically to check on the cub, whose breathing had grown steadier, stronger. By morning, the first rays of pale winter sunlight crept through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Sarah stretched, rubbing her stiff neck before moving to check on their tiny patient. The cub's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then narrowing slightly as he took in his surroundings. His body tensed instinctively, though he was too weak to move. "Hey there, tough guy," Sarah murmured, her voice soft but firm. "You're all right." Jim leaned forward, watching. The cub was alive, awake. That alone was a victory. Sarah carefully removed the four, replacing it with a shallow dish of electrolyte solution. "He's strong," she noted, observing the way his ears flicked at the sound of her voice. Most cubs this malnourished wouldn't have lasted. Whatever fight he's got in him, it saved his life. Jim exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. "Told you he was different." The next week was critical. The cub, who Sarah had started calling Max, slowly regained his strength. At first, he could barely lift his head, let alone stand, but as the days passed, his movements became steadier, his appetite returning in cautious increments. Sarah fed him small portions of nutrient-rich meals, increasing the amount gradually. He was wary of human contact, which was a good sign. It meant his wild instincts were intact. He tolerated their presence but never sought it, always keeping a watchful distance when he had the strength to move. Jim visited daily, often just sitting in silence, watching as Max adjusted to his temporary home. The cub still bore the signs of his ordeal, ribs prominent, fur patchy from stress, but his eyes were sharper now, more aware. Every so often, he would glance at Jim with something resembling recognition. Not trust, but not fear either. A truce. By the end of the second week, Max was strong enough to leave the intensive care unit. Sarah transferred him to a larger enclosure, one designed to mimic his natural environment as much as possible. Rocks, logs, and hidden compartments encouraged exploration and problem-solving, vital skills for a predator that would one day have to fend for itself. Max was cautious at first, stepping hesitantly onto unfamiliar terrain, testing the ground beneath his paws. Then something clicked. His instincts took over, and he began to move with more confidence, stretching, climbing, regaining the fluid grace that had been dulled by starvation and exhaustion. "He's adapting fast," Sarah observed, leaning against the enclosure's outer fence. Jim stood beside her, nodding. "That's a good thing." The real challenge, however, was yet to come. As Max grew stronger, his natural instincts resurfaced in full force. He became more aggressive during feeding times, guarding his meals with low-warning growls, his claws unsheathed and warning if anyone came too close. That was exactly what Sarah wanted. He needed to retain his wild nature, needed to understand that humans were not his allies. They were facilitators, nothing more. But there was one problem. "He's watching you," Sarah pointed out one afternoon as they observed him from a distance. Max was perched on a thick log, his golden eyes locked onto Jim, his tail flicking lazily behind him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't aggression. It was curiosity. "You were the first person to help him. He remembers that." Jim exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's not good." Sarah nodded. "No, it's not. A wild animal that associated humans with safety would never survive in the wild. It would either starve because it lacked the fear-driven caution necessary to hunt effectively, or it would wander too close to human settlements and be deemed a threat. Either way, it was a death sentence. "We need to limit your interaction," Sarah decided. "Starting now." Jim understood, but that didn't make it any easier. He had spent weeks watching over the cub, ensuring he had a chance at survival. Now he had to step back, let nature take over. It was the right call. It was the only call. But damn, it was hard. He stayed away after that, leaving Sarah and her team to handle Max's care. The cub continued to grow, his coat thickening, his muscles strengthening as he honed his hunting skills. Sarah introduced live prey into his enclosure: mice, then rabbits, then larger game. Max hesitated at first, uncertain, but instinct won out. He became a killer, swift and efficient. That was exactly what they needed. Weeks turned into months. Max was no longer a cub but a young predator, sleek and powerful. His weight had doubled, his movements precise, calculated. He was ready. And then came the hard part. His release. Sarah had scouted a suitable location far from human settlements, within a dense forest rich with prey and protective terrain. It was time. Jim stood beside the transport crate, staring down at the now-grown bobcat. Max's ears twitched, his muscles coiled, sensing the change in atmosphere. "This is it, kid," Jim murmured. "Time to go home." Sarah unlatched the crate. The door swung open. Max didn't move. Not at first. He stood there, golden eyes flicking between Sarah and Jim, his body language unreadable. A long pause stretched between them, tension thick in the air. Then, with the same quiet determination that had carried him through his fight for survival, Max stepped forward. He moved cautiously at first, his paws pressing into the snow, testing the ground. Then he picked up speed, slipping into the undergrowth with effortless grace. Just before he vanished completely, he paused, looked back. Their eyes met one last time, and then he was gone. The forest swallowed him whole, the undergrowth shifting slightly in his wake before settling into stillness. Jim exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. Sarah stood beside him, arms crossed tightly, her expression unreadable as she stared at the empty space where Max had disappeared. "That's it," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "He's on his own now." Jim nodded, his gaze still locked on the tree line. "Yeah." A strange heaviness settled over him. He had always known this day would come, had spent months preparing for it, but now that it was here, it felt different. Final. "He'll be all right," Sarah said after a moment, as if sensing his thoughts. "He's strong. He knows how to hunt. He knows how to survive." Jim let out a quiet chuckle. Hell, he knew how to survive before we even found him. They lingered for a few more minutes, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, as if hoping for one last sign of Max before heading back to the truck. The drive home was silent, both lost in their thoughts. Jim found himself staring out the window, watching the snow-covered landscape pass by in a blur. His mind kept circling back to that last look, the way Max had paused, had hesitated. Wild animals didn't do that. Not unless... No. He shook the thought away. That was dangerous thinking. Assigning human emotions to something purely instinct-driven. Max wasn't looking back at them. He was looking at his past, at the only world he had known for the last few months, before stepping fully into the one he was meant for. That was all. Days passed. Then a week. Then two. Jim resumed his usual work, monitoring predator populations, tracking migration patterns, documenting changes in the ecosystem as winter began its slow transition into spring. He told himself he wasn't watching for signs of Max. Told himself he wasn't glancing at every set of tracks in the snow, every shadow moving through the trees, hoping for some confirmation that the cub had made it. But the truth gnawed at him. The wilderness was unforgiving, even for the strongest. He had done everything he could to prepare Max, but that didn't mean the odds were in his favor. Then, 3 weeks after the release, Jim found them. Tracks. Small, distinct, unmistakably bobcat. Fresh. His pulse kicked up as he crouched, tracing the familiar pattern with his gloved fingertips. They were steady, purposeful, not the erratic, meandering prints of a starving animal, but the confident stride of a predator that knew exactly where it was going. Nearby, a half-eaten rabbit carcass lay partially buried in the snow, claw marks visible on the torn flesh. A clean kill. Jim smiled. Attaboy. Over the following months, sporadic sightings confirmed what the tracks had already told him: Max was alive. Thriving. The rehab center's motion-triggered cameras caught glimpses of him moving through the designated release area, his body lean and powerful, his coat sleek and full. He had taken to his territory well, avoiding humans, hunting efficiently. He had done exactly what he was meant to do. Jim should have felt relief, maybe even satisfaction. Instead, he felt something else. something he didn't want to name. Spring bled into summer. The land transformed, the deep snows giving way to wildflowers, the rivers swelling with melted ice. Jim threw himself into his work, filling his days with field research, community meetings, conservation efforts, anything to keep himself busy. Sarah, too, buried herself in the never-ending cycle of animal rehabilitation, her passion driving her forward. They didn't talk about Max much. There was no need. They had done their part. And then, just as suddenly as he had left, Max came back. It was late autumn, the air carrying the first true bite of approaching winter. Jim had been out conducting a routine survey near the rehab center, checking on the local deer population when something made him stop. A feeling, an instinct, honed over years of tracking animals through the wild. Slowly he turned, scanning the dense foliage behind him. Silence. Nothing moved. But he knew better. "Come on, kid," he murmured under his breath. "I know you're there." A flicker of movement. A shadow shifting between the trees. Then, out of the underbrush, a pair of golden eyes locked onto his. Max. He had grown. No longer the half-starved cub they had rescued, but a fully matured bobcat, powerful and confident. His shoulders had broadened, his coat had thickened for the winter months, his gaze sharper than ever. He stood perfectly still, watching Jim with that same unreadable intensity. Jim barely breathed. The moment stretched between them, heavy with something unspoken. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Max turned and disappeared back into the forest, his movements smooth, effortless. Jim let out a slow breath. He had needed to see that. Had needed the confirmation that Max wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. He had made it. When he returned to the rehab center that evening, Sarah was in her office, flipping through paperwork. She glanced up as he entered, arching an eyebrow. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jim smirked, dropping into the chair across from her. "Saw Max today." That got her attention. She set her papers down, leaning forward. "Really?" Jim nodded. "Big. Healthy. Doing exactly what he should be doing." A slow smile spread across Sarah's face. "That's good." Jim exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, it is." For the first time in a long while, he let himself fully believe it. Max had found his place in the wild. And Jim had finally let him go. Winter came early that year. The first heavy snowfall blanketed the Montana wilderness in late October, draping the towering pines in thick white layers, silencing the land beneath its frozen weight. The rivers slowed, the lakes crusted over with ice, and the animals of the forest settled into the familiar rhythm of survival. For Jim, the changing season meant longer hours in the field, monitoring predator movements, tracking elk herds, ensuring the balance of the ecosystem remained intact. But no matter how busy he kept himself, Max was never far from his thoughts. It had been weeks since his last sighting. Not unusual bobcats were solitary creatures by nature, avoiding unnecessary contact, even with those who had once helped them. Jim told himself that was a good thing. It meant Max had fully reclaimed his place in the wild. But that didn't stop him from scanning the forest during his patrols, from lingering just a little longer than necessary whenever he came across fresh tracks in the snow. One evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, Jim was driving back from a survey near the northern edge of the forest when his radio crackled to life. "Dad, you there?" Sarah's voice, urgent. Jim grabbed the receiver. "I'm here." "What's wrong?" "I think you should come to the center," she said. "Now." The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Sarah, just get here." The line went dead. Jim didn't waste time. He turned the truck around, tires kicking up powder as he sped down the icy road, headlights cutting through the creeping darkness. He had no idea what to expect when he arrived, but his gut told him it was something big. Something that mattered. When he pulled up to the rehab center, Sarah was already outside, bundled in her heavy coat, arms crossed against the cold. But she wasn't alone. There, just beyond the fence line, half hidden in the tree line, a familiar shape waited. Max. But he wasn't alone either. Jim barely breathed as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, taking in the smaller figure beside him. A cub. His cub. Sarah spoke first, her voice low, steady. "I picked up movement on the outer cameras an hour ago." Didn't believe it at first, but then she gestured to the two bobcats, their bodies still as statues, watching them in return. "I think he brought her here." Jim exhaled, slow and measured. Max had found a mate, had fathered a cub, and somehow, for some reason, had chosen to bring her here. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with the same quiet confidence he had always carried, Max took a step forward. His cub a tiny, wide-eyed replica of what he had once been hesitated, then followed. Jim felt something tighten in his chest. He understood now. Max remembered. Not as a pet remembers a master, not in the way a domesticated animal would recall a caretaker, but as something deeper. As a creature of the wild remembers the rare moments when survival had hinged on the presence of another. Sarah inhaled sharply. "He's hurt." Jim saw it then, the slight hitch in Max's step, the way he favored his left side. An injury, though not severe. He had survived worse. But his cub, she was too young, too thin, too much like he had once been. Jim moved first, slowly, deliberately. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but when he reached the outer gate, Max didn't run, didn't retreat. He simply stood there, golden eyes locked onto Jim's. A silent understanding passed between them. Then, just as before, Max stepped back, but his cub remained. Jim crouched, extending a gloved hand, careful not to startle her. The little bobcat tensed but didn't bolt. "Not yet." "She's weak," Sarah murmured. "If we don't take her in." "We're taking her in," Jim said without hesitation. Sarah glanced at him, searching his face, but she didn't argue. She didn't need to. They had been here before. Jim reached into his coat, pulling out the same jacket he had once wrapped around Max all those months ago. The cub twitched but didn't resist as he gently swaddled her in the warm fabric, lifting her carefully. She was light. Too light. But she was alive. When Jim stood, Max was still there, watching. "You did good, kid," Jim said softly. "Real good." For a moment, Max held his gaze. And then, just like before, he was gone. The forest took him back, his presence fading into the night like a whisper. Jim didn't chase him. He didn't need to. Because this time, he knew Max wasn't running. He was trusting. Trusting Jim to do for his cub what had once been done for him. Sarah let out a shaky breath. "Come on. Let's get her inside." Jim nodded, following her into the warmth of the clinic. And just like that, the cycle began again. A second chance. A new beginning. And proof that even in the wildest corners of the world, some bonds were never truly broken.